And welcome this morning. We are delighted to have Dr. Christina Bradstreet joining us today. Christina, I hope you can hear us okay. Christina is going to be talking to us today. Christina is guest curator at Watts Gallery and author of Scented Visions, Smell in Victorian Art, 1850 to 1915. And this event is part of the Association for Art History Festival. And we're delighted that you're going to be talking to us today about Watts is choosing, sight versus scent. So we can't wait to hear more. Thanks, Christina.
Thanks, Charlie. Thank you to the Watts Gallery for inviting me to give a talk. As Charlie said, I'm the guest curator for the Scented Visions exhibition, which is now on at Watts Gallery until the 9th of November. But as it happens, I'm also the curator or programmer for the Art History Festival, which takes place this week nationwide, from Orkney to Guernsey. We have 100 museums and galleries around the country, all putting on events, championing and promoting, celebrating art history. So there's lots going on at museums and galleries around the country. And today's the first day. It goes on until Sunday. So I put the link to the program in the chat, so you can have a look and see what's going on, either locally to you or online. So I'll just put my slides up. Give me a moment. There we go. And so next week I'm going to be doing another talk for the Watts Gallery online, where I'll be talking about nature in the exhibition. And I'll give more of a tour of the exhibition. But this talk is focusing solely on one painting. It's the very first painting that you'll come to when you go into the exhibition space. Struggling to seem to change my slide. Oh, there we go. It all happened at once. There we go. Okay. So it's the very first painting that you'll come to as you come into the exhibition space. And I can't see, and I would argue actually that it's the most important painting in the exhibition. I can't tell you how delighted I was when the National Portrait Gallery committed to lending it to us. It needed to be in this exhibition, not just because it's a painting by Watts for the Watts Gallery, and not just because it makes a great poster image, not just because it's a woman smelling a flower or because it's a stunning showstopper of a painting, but I think because it's a pivotal painting in the history of scented visions, the story that I'm trying to tell about the history of scent in Victorian paintings. It's the earliest example of a painting that I found in which the motif of a woman smelling a flower with eyes closed is the primary focus of the painting. So actually that's the challenge for you all to find me early examples, but I mean examples where the woman smelling the flower or the person smelling the flower is really kind of up close and central to the painting. There are earlier examples of women holding or near flowers, even smelling flowers. Rubens and Bruegel's The Sense of Smell at the Prado Museum is a good example of that. But the specific gesture of smelling, especially with the eyes closed in a state of reverie, was not a dominant or central motif in Western art before Watts's painting of Choosing from 1864. By the turn of the 20th century, however, it was absolutely ubiquitous in art and visual culture. You see it in lithographs. For example, on the left, you've got the famous Gibson girls, one of the Gibson girl models who was kind of advertising everything in American turn of the 20th century culture. On the right, there's an iconic photograph of Helen Keller smelling a flower while feeling the braille of a book there. You could think of Fred Hollanday's homoerotic art photography. This one's Hypnos, referring to opium. It's there in perfume ads and packaging, on early postcards and greeting cards. And of course in J.W. Waterhouse's The Soul of the Rose from 1908, which is the cover image of my book, which is also called Scented Visions. smell in art, 1850 to 1914. But I do believe that this gesture of a woman smelling a rose that became so popular by the turn of the 20th century started here with Watts's choosing. And in fact, we know that there are direct links between Waterhouse looking at Watts's choosing when he painted this. So choosing is a painting that absolutely epitomizes the move in art away from pre-Raphaelite realism towards Victorian aestheticism. So that's another reason why this painting is important. So for pre-Raphaelite realism, if you think of the earlier pre-Raphaelite paintings, paintings that tell a moralizing narrative that chimes with Victorian fears and anxieties about the social realities of Victorian life. So, for example, in the exhibition, we've got John Rodwell and Spencer Stanhope's Thoughts of the Past from 1859. This is a Victorian realist painting in which you see a sex worker. She would have been identified as such by her long, loose red hair, the coins on the table, the gentleman's walking cane, which you might just see on the floor there. And she's standing by an open window that overlooks the Thames. This painting was made in 1858, exhibited in 1859. Well, 1858 was the year of the Great Stink, when Parliament had to close early because the stench from the Thames, from the sewage in the Thames, was so bad that Parliament couldn't hack it, closed early. So the idea with this painting is that the woman is people would have kind of read this as her being tainted by or tainted as the stench from the Thames at a time when people believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease was caused by odor. So that's pre-Raphaelite realism, and Watts's choosing is moved away from that towards Victorian aestheticism. So think of art for art's sake. The idea that art doesn't have to have a kind of moral meaning or narrative. It's not trying to teach you anything. It's just a focus on pleasure, on hedonism. So you have these exquisite sensations, beautiful colors, the glorious colors, but also the sense of smell, the sense of the fragrant violets that she's holding in her hands. So this is interesting because what we're seeing then is an early aestheticist painting that is placing scent and synesthesia, the idea that one sense can evoke the other sense. So here, when we look at the visual beauty of this painting, that we can have this kind of sensation of scent as we look at it. It's placing this painting is placing scent right at the heart of the aestheticism of Victorian aestheticism, right from the beginning of that movement. So it's a key painting, one of the earliest to show a woman smelling a flower as the central motif of a painting. And because of its glorious colours and fragrant violets and motif of smelling, it's playing scent and synesthesia right at the centre of Victorian aestheticism, the movement that follows pre-Raphaelitism. And that's important to me because it's perhaps the key argument that I've set out to argue in my book and in the exhibition, that scent was central to aestheticism. It's odd to me, but it's something that's not really been said before, actually. Aestheticism, so think of the works of Rossetti, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, or Frederick Sands, Simeon Solomon, Burne-Jones, and others. All of these works, or many of these works, were impregnated with scent. They seem to diffuse scent into our space as we look into them. Not every work by any means, but a good number of them. And it's something that seems to have been understood in the Victorian period, but has since been forgotten. So if you look at any modern art history book on pre-Raphaelitism or aestheticism, you won't find the words scent or smell or perfume or fragrance or any of those kind of words in the index. You might find a passing reference to the fact to the sort of multisensory nature of aestheticism. Usually there's a quote about the rich jewel-like colours, the very tactile nature. Often you see a lot of kind of velvet or fur sort of materials that you want to stroke. Often they represent music or have titles that suggest music, like Whistler's paintings. There may be just the word fragrance might just sort of be mentioned, but that's all. But the Victorians knew, and the Edwardians knew, that scent was at the heart of aestheticism. This is a cartoon by Max Beerbohm from 1904, which is kind of taking the piss out of Victorian aestheticism. It's called Dante Gabriele in his back garden. And at the centre, you see this dreamy, droopy Edward Burne-Jones nonchalantly presenting a flower to a kangaroo, a wallaby to sniff. It's an allusion to the painter Rossetti's penchant for keeping exotic pets at his Chelsea home. And then surrounding this motif of the wallaby smelling a flower, you have this whole cast circle of the pre-Raphaelite movement, Victorian art world figures. These earphones won't stay in my ear. So you have this kind of caricatured cast of Victorian art world figures. Here's William Morris pontificating behind Lizzie Siddall with the long red hair. Sorry, this is my. I'm just going to take it up. So then you have Whistler, and the comedic figure of Whistler there with his sort of bohemian moustache, and the hawk-nosed, keen-eyed John Ruskin, the art critic there. So for the dandy and humorous Beerbohm, playfully looking back on aestheticism in his 1904 book, The Poet's Corner, this image of sniffing a flower and appreciating its scent offers a very simple and direct way to encapsulate and parody Victorian aesthetic sensibilities. So here, this simple gesture of smelling a flower embodies several key concepts for aestheticism: hedonism, pleasure and exquisite sensations, and a preoccupation with beauty, the vogue for synesthesia, evoking one sense through another in art, poetry, or music. And even the penchant for art like scent to evoke moods, emotions, and vague yet keenly felt associations. It signals the abundance of flowers in the paintings of Rossetti and Burne-Jones, and even kind of points the way to the floral emblems of the aesthetic movement and decadence. So Oscar Wilde, sunflowers and green carnations. At the same time, Burne-Jones's very kind of mannered gesture points to the perceived affectation of aesthetes as ridiculed by Gilbert and Sullivan in their satirical play Patience from 1881. While his gaunt and enervated appearance references the fleshly school of poetry with its weary, wasting yet exquisite sensuality. So the fleshly school of poetry was a very vitriolic essay that was written to attack the work of artists like Rossetti as being too sensual, kind of unhealthy, as I say, weary and wasting. Above all, that one simple gesture of the wallaby sniffing a rose or a flower references the prevalence of sensory stimuli such as music and perfume in the art and literature of Victorian aestheticism, while aligning the aesthetics of scent with uncivilized animal behaviors and an unwholesome obsession with the pursuit of beauty. So Max Beerbohm knew that scent was central to aestheticism. He put it right at the center of his cartoon. But the significance of scent or smell in Victorian aestheticism paintings has been entirely overlooked until now, until my research. So what I've set out to do is show that how 19th century ideas about the sense of smell in general and about particular odors as well inform the meanings of these paintings, often in ways that we might find quite surprising today, because we don't think about smell as disease. We don't think of smell as an intoxicating, having a drug-like effect. We don't think of rainbows as giving off a scent that signals the presence of God. And so, well, I think that by the turn of the 20th century, the image of a woman smelling a rose was often little more than a shorthand for referencing female beauty. In the mid-Victorian period, images of women smelling flowers could be much more complex than that. And that's why we start the exhibition with a room called Smelling Flowers, showing all the kind of different, or some of the different meanings that this motif can have. Watts's choosing on first glance probably doesn't look like a very complex painting to read. A beautiful girl burying her nose into a luscious bloom, a camellia. She has her eyes closed, allowing us, or at least the lusty male Victorian viewer, to voyeuristically watch her unabashed. So by inviting the male voyeur to observe a young woman smelling a flower and her intimate, erotic or emotional response to the scent, Watts is asserting and reinforcing patriarchal ideas about female behavior and what determines modesty and innocent flirtation versus seduction, transgression and obscenity, while inviting fantasy over these possibilities. You might think, what more is there to say? It's a beautiful painting of a beautiful woman. Well, plenty, as it turns out. And when we think about this painting in the context of 19th century ideas about the senses and the sense of smell in particular, but also the Victorian language of flowers, turns out this painting is really quite complex indeed, and there's a lot of sort of toing and froing of how you could kind of read this painting. So that's what I'm going to get into now. Also, when we think about this painting in the context of Watts's life and his marriage to the sitter, Ellen Terry, which I'll come on to, but you'll have to be patient with me, those of you who know the story of Watts and Ellen, so that will come later in my talk. So Watts's portrait of Dame Ellen Terry choosing is a girl depicted in the process of choosing between the luscious showy blooms of the cultivated red camellia pressed to her face and the handful of humble, sweet-smelling violets clutched to her heart. The gardeners among you will know that camellias are unscented. And the Watts fans among you will know that this is a painting of his young wife, Ellen Terry, the actress. So Ellen is acting the role of smelling flowers. These flowers don't have a smell. The camellias don't have a flower. She's acting that role. But you don't need to know that this is Ellen necessarily when you look at this painting to start thinking about it. So what we have is an unscented camellia that she's making a big show of smelling, and then the scented humble violets in her hand. So the girl's choice, remember the painting is called Choosing, is between scented violets and unscented glossy camellias, which starts to get interesting when you start to think about this as a choice then between sight and smell, the visual showy blooms, and the olfactory, the scented violets, and think about them in terms of the relative value systems that were embedded within the Victorian hierarchy of the senses, and all of the kind of web of associations that existed around these senses. So at first glance, choosing is an image of a woman lost in scented reverie. Yet this isn't actually reverie, a scene of reverie, because it's an active painting. She's in the process of choosing. And Watts has designed the composition to emphasize this theme, this action. Her hand pressing the camellia against her nose at the top left of the painting is diametrically opposed to the palm cupping the violets at the bottom right. And so with one hand held high and the other low, the figure action stimulates a pair of weighing scales, the merits of each flower being weighed up and evaluated in her hands. So in this way, she might emulate the figure of Justice, who's traditionally depicted holding a beam balance upon which he measures the respective strengths of the opposing sides of an argument. Several artistic devices in the painting promotes the movement of the eye between the camellias and the violets, sustaining the viewer's contemplation. So you keep going backwards and forwards between the choice presented. With her side-on stance, so she's shown with her arm in foreshortening, the hand holding the violets appears closer to the viewer's plane of vision than the hand holding the camellia. So the eye is drawn in and out of the painting, back and forth from hand to hand, in a manner imitating the process of deliberation. Furthermore, the painting provides ocular direction from point to point. The downward slant of the figure's lip, nostril, and eyebrow, and the downward fall of her hair leads the eye down through the painting. The eye is forced away from the center of our visual focus, the point of intersection between the nose and the camellia, down through the painting to the lower canvas, where it settles on the image of the hand holding the violets. And then this little raised index finger points us back up again. At the same time, the string of pearls around the girl's neck creates this diagonal thrust in the opposite direction. So we've got a kind of division through the painting in that way, driving the eye upwards from bottom left to upper right. So we have this emphasis of this division of the painting into two domains: the upper, which is presided by the camellia, and the lower part of the painting presided by the violets. And the upward slant of the inner folds of the petals of the camellia here and here, and the major veins of several of the leaves, and even the tilt of her jawline reinforces this division through the painting. So this reading demonstrates that the girl's attention is not static. She's not lost in reverie, but she's going back and forth from flower to flower. And although her attention appears absorbed by the dominant camellia blossoms, we can infer that her thoughts, the violets, remain in her thoughts. This visual and olfactory choice presented would have been apparent to many of the Royal Academy exhibition goers when this painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 1864. And they would have perhaps thought about the juxtaposition of these early spring blooms, which presented a familiar set of ideas within both the domain of the gardening and the symbolic language of flowers. So, for example, I found in a book called Every Lady's Guide to Her Own Greenhouse from 1851, written by a lady. The competition for display space in the greenhouse is discussed in terms of an appraisal of color versus scent. Which should you prioritize? And the author says, the violet has nothing grand in its appearance, but its perfume amply compensates for its deficiency of show. On the other hand, the camellia, which is most beautiful, is destitute of fragrance altogether. To some extent, the dilemma is resolved by the author's advice. She says, we may always be permitted to forgo a little beauty for the sake of fragrance, but not to any great extent. Is it more important to have the showy blooms in the greenhouse? So the author seems to presume that beauty is a visual phenomenon, that scent is not something that we would call beautiful, and that the traditional hierarchy of the senses, in which the aesthetic status of sight is more highly valued than smell, is upheld. However, in terms of the ideal ratio of visual beauty to fragrance, this counsel remains ambiguous, suggesting the potential for deliberation, which is so key to Watts's painting. The theme of choice or dilemma in the painting, with the violets and camellias defined as opposite, suggests a bipolar pattern of moral thinking. The appraisal of the bloom shifts easily to that of moral values. We understand that one flower may represent virtue and one vice. That might seem quite odd to us today, but I think would have been quite common in Victorian thinking, because this painting, just to show you some close-ups here before I move on. Yeah, so this painting belongs to a genre of Victorian narrative painting that includes Alfred Elmore's On the Brink from 1865, where we see the juxtaposition of the white lily with a purple passion flower. So the lily representing purity, and the passion flower, passion, lustful temptation. And what we're seeing is the choice faced by a Victorian, a female gambler. She's gone to this gambling parlor. Should she repay her debts through prostitution or face up to poverty? The question is unresolved. Her life is on the brink. And as an entry in Punch magazine put it, ease for Mr. Elmore, the artist. She's tempted to sin. She's fair. Will the lily or the passion flower win? And then you can see how two flowers can suggest this kind of moral dilemma. So one way to interpret choosing, therefore, is to say that the spectacle of the camellias located high in the painting represents vision, the most noble of the senses, while the little humble violet flowers, violets with their specific association with fragrance, signify the lowly sense of smell. So in this way, the Watts's painting conforms to a traditional model of the hierarchy of the senses in which sight is privileged above smell. Figuratively speaking, it has the upper hand in the painting. In burying her nose in the camellia, she's made her noble choice, we could say. Yeah, by reflecting the intricacy of 19th century attitudes towards smell and its shifting aesthetic status, the painting suggests a more complex interpretation. Aromas or essences are often understood to signify inner truth. Scent comes literally from the heart of matter. And the word essence comes from the Latin essere, to be. And so in the 19th century, floral fragrance as the essence of a flower commonly symbolized truth or soul, spirit. Later in the 1880s, this will become a particularly relevant when the horticulturalist William Robinson and the artist and designer William Morris decried the soullessness of modern regimental or patterned gardens. Think of park gardens with showy, vibrant, pretentious bedding flowers, such as marigolds, cultivated in the greenhouse for bedding displays, which had displaced old-fashioned scented blooms. For William Morris, the demise of the rambling cottage garden, with its connotations of rural England, was symbolically aligned with the spiritual void that he saw in post-industrial capitalist age. For him, scientific rationalism, materialistic tendencies, and bourgeois worldliness could not compensate for the loss of traditional values. Indeed, Watts might be pointing to Marxian concerns here. The cultivated, scentless flower with its glossy refinery, possessed by the girl in her superficial show of flat smelling, might symbolize the alienation of the senses in the industrial world, which emphasized property and sense of having over a sincere appreciation of valuing of objects fully experienced through the senses. So this is like someone showing conspicuous consumption, showing off what she has, but really there's no value behind it. There's no sort of integrity to it. It has no sense of smell. It has no scent. Already in the 1860s, scent could stand for spiritual finery and true inner beauty, while petals were a recurrent symbol for superficial beauty and the body's outward facade. For example, the anonymous author of an article called Flower Odors, published in the Boston-based literary journal Continental Monthly in 1864, the same year as this painting, describes how some flowers look like their fragrance, such as pond lilies, which breathe forth the inspiration of the sun. Others, such as the modest heliotrope, startle by the contrast between their outer being and their inner spirit. And then the author goes on to pose the question, if a flower's soul speaks through odor, what of scentless blossoms? So the author there is suggesting that voiceless or soulless camellias are not irredeemable. They're not soulless. She's drawing on familiar Victorian tropes of disability and heaven, the idea that the blind will be able to see in heaven, or the disabled will be able to walk again. So the author imagines that the camellia is dumb, to use Victorian word, or mute, and deprived of language, but that hopes in a more spiritual existence in heaven, we shall behold their very doubles, gifted with novel charm, a captivating perfume we cannot conceive of here. So I love this idea that when the camellia gets to heaven, it will have a scent. Moreover, in the vast harmony of the universe, one cannot believe that there can be any instruments whose strings are never to be awakened. And that those words, for me, play upon the iconography of Watts's Hope, blind hope, which what's treated here in this a very iconic painting, in which a blindfolded woman is shown sitting upon a globe, plucking the last remaining strings on her lyre. The use of olfactory metaphors to convey moral behavior was common in mid-19th century writings, with sweet scent prized as indicative of intrinsic moral value or goodness. A decade earlier, in his essay Slavery in Massachusetts from 1854, the transcendentalist writer Henry David Thoreau, whose writings were always on the trail of some scent, used an extended olfactory metaphor to establish moral behavior. Pronouncing the Fugitive Slave Act or Bloodhound Law of 1850, which required escaped slaves to be returned to their masters, as offensive to our nostrils, he compared abolition to the pure scent of a water lily and the repugnant reality of slavery with the noxious sludge at the bottom of the pond. He wrote, "So behave that the odor of your actions may enhance the general sweetness of the atmosphere, that when we behold or scent a flower, we may not be reminded how inconsistent your deeds are with it. For all odor is but one form of advertisement of a moral quality. And if fair actions had not been performed, the lily would not smell as sweet. The foul slime stands for the sloth and vice of man. The decay of humanity, the fragrant flower that springs from it, for the purity and courage which are immortal." Despite the very different context of Watts's choosing, it could likewise have been understood that the sweet scent of the violets are an index of, or indicator of, moral virtue, of goodness. Since flowers were laden with moral symbolism in 19th century art and literature, the floral iconography of choosing also has a strong bearing upon its interpretation. In the Victorian language of flowers, violets were familiar symbols of modesty and Christian humility. I found this great Victorian religious treatise or tract called "The Uses of the Senses When Engaged in Contemplating the External World" from 1848. It's by an author called Catherine Lake, and it's about the promotion of female moral education. So in the book, in this kind of story, two female companions take a country stroll and they're musing upon spiritual matters along the way. The violet, they observe, with its charming simplicity and humble and comely array, can be personified as the perfect role model for the virtuous young lady. Women should strive to be sincere and unpretending, avoid earthly gain, and seek to attain true simplicity. They should emulate, be like the modest violet, imitating the humility of a flower that retreats from the gaze and hides its pure beauty from view. Though the visual charms of the violet were hid from many an eye, its presence was made known by the sweet odor it exhaled. And the author goes on, "Yes, unlike the gaudy tulip that is gaily dressed, this retiring flower gives out a fragrance that gratifies the senses and affords a pleasure to the mind, yet never sends forth applauds a pleasure to the mind. If we spiritualize a companion, there are those who, like the gay tulip, possess beauty, yet never send forth the odor of piety. On the contrary, many of God's dear children who are poor in this world's goods and having little outwardly to attract the eye are content to blossom in obscurity and there in works of holiness and love amidst sweet fragrance. So in other words, don't be like the showy camellia, a sort of glossy, insincere, showy woman wearing beautiful clothes, but be more like the tulip, humble and quiet, hiding away in the hedgerow, but doing good deeds. So Watts's painting, like Lake's preaching, draws on this shared floral symbolism that's both visual and olfactory. Now, the Art Journal, one of the leading Victorian journals of the day, where you would find reviews of the summer exhibition and other exhibitions, and the Art Journal described the painting as nothing more than the head of a girl leaning forward in the act of smelling and choosing a flower. So a very basic interpretation. But this basic iconographical interpretation offered in most of the reviews of 1864 was actually of a young woman torn between worldly vanities and a more modest, spiritually rewarding way of life. So I think although the Art Journal critic didn't really get it, most critics did. Her choices between the materiality and pretentiousness of visual display and the unseen qualities, the scent of the virtuous soul. In this context, the brilliant camellias lack moral substance, are light on the scales and hence higher in the picture, while the lowly violets, despite their diminutive appearance, are weightier and more substantial. The objective superficiality of sight, represented by the large, luscious and brilliant coloured flat camellias, is pitted against the true emotions and virtues of smell invoked by the humble, sweet-scented violets. Indeed, the Victorian moral code referenced in this floral juxtaposition was deciphered by the critic of The Spectator, who noted that the moral of it seems to be that she prefers the violets which she holds in her hand to the more showy attractions of the scented camellias. Now, given that the model seems to be so absorbed in the camellias, not really paying much attention to the violets, that might seem surprising to us, that the Spectator critic would read it this way. However, I think Victorian viewers were accustomed to decoding these kind of symbolic, didactic messages within Victorian paintings. So by suggesting the virtues of fragrance over colour, Watts's choosing raises questions about the integrity of the visual. Indeed, the theme of ocular deception is integral to the picture's meaning. The central paradox of the picture, the action of smelling an unscented flower, was acknowledged in The Spectator by the italicization of the word smelling, and in the Illustrated London News with the phrase smells in vain. Adept at decoding visual puns, viewers at the 1864 Royal Academy Summer Exhibition would have appreciated the implicit suggestion of the double entendre of vanity. The futility of smelling opulent but scentless blooms conveys ideas of temptation, superficiality, and pretentious materialism. Despite its rich suffit of colour, the camellia is not all it pretends to be. It's odorless and therefore lacking in soul. Moreover, the act of voraciously breathing in the fragrance of an unscented flower could point to the insatiability of human desire and the futility of pursuing individual wants over collective needs. The idea of beauty as a mask that conceals an inner void was suggested in a number of 19th century literary contexts, including a French tale where flowers metamorphosize into women. In the story, the female personification of the camellia is told, "You are beautiful, madam, but you have none of the true beauty, which is known as love." In The Garden, in Victorian literature, a book from 1988 by a historian called Michael Walters, Michael Walters argues that throughout the poetry and fiction of the age, fragrance, or the lack of it, serves as an extraordinary, reliable index of general merit. However, the iconography of camellias in the 19th century complicates this reading of choosing, and indicates greater ambiguity within the symbolic system that Waters allows for. So although the pose of smelling an unscented flower suggests pretense and acting, in the Victorian language of flowers, the red camellia actually represents unpretending excellence and inner warmth. So the exact opposite of what I've just been suggesting. The camellia in the language of flowers was a symbol for the converted courtesan transformed by the power of love into a loyal mistress. So we find that in Alexandre Dumas's novel, The Dame aux Camélias from 1848. Another text we could look to is Ces Dames of 1860 by Vermorel. And that was a kind of a guide to the various stock types of filles de joie or French working girls. And in that, the camellia is identified as a reformed courtesan distinguished by her devotion and fidelity to a single partner. While their sincerity and disinterestedness was often questioned, camellias were models of tenderness and fidelity. Now, this is hugely important, hugely significant when we consider the painting in terms of its personal significance to Watts. Since the artist, as I've said, was his first wife, Ellen Terry. Watts, aged 46, married the actress on February the 20th, 1864, 7 days before her 17th birthday, considering it his duty to remove her from the temptations and abominations of the stage, as he wrote in a letter to a friend. So there's Ellen Terry, age 16, and Watts. And since Ellen is depicted wearing her silk wedding dress, which was actually designed by the pre-Raphaelite artist William Holman Hunt, the picture is believed to have been painted shortly after their wedding day. So when considered in this context, we might read the painting as Watts's private commemoration of the process so recently undertaken by Terry of choosing between a flamboyant life on the stage and a comparatively sheltered life as Watts's wife and muse, celebrating her move away from an active presence in public life. Watts is presenting her as a flower, with the fusion of the fragrant and feminine, evoking a hyper image of passive, static, and anonymous femininity. So I'm showing you just one of the examples of the paintings that Ellen Terry sat for Watts. So she moves away from being, the actress on the stage to kind of acting roles here as Ophelia for Watts in his paintings, a much kind of more quiet, demure sort of life. Arguably, the painting conveys Watts's paternalistic optimism that by relinquishing fame and adulation and degradations of the stage, Ellen, under his guidance, had opted to embark upon a nobler course of life. By casting aside her personal ambition for the institution of marriage, she proved herself a self-regulating agent or actor within her own life, making the rational and restrained choice following a process of measured deliberation. Watts considered her career as a distraction, a false turn, like sniffing the unscented camellia. But by marrying him, she'd found her way. Moreover, in choosing her mate, she's undergone a form of sexual selection or choosing, casting aside potential suitors from the fickle world of the theatre for an older, wiser, and more stable partner. Instead of becoming a glamorous, cultivated flower bred for stage appearances, but lacking scent or soul, she's taken the authentic path of womanhood, opting for the natural role of wife with its potential for motherhood. Choosing was painted at a time when an important cultural shift was taking place. The notion of reason as the mind's ability to make common sense decisions to further the collective good was increasingly replaced with an understanding of rationality as the decisions behind an individual's chosen path, irrespective of wisdom. Seen in this context, the painting warns against the perils faced by women in pursuit of their whims. The personification of Ellen as a camellia or courtesan is pertinent, given the contemporary notion of actresses as being women of ill repute. Being an actress was seen as kind of nearly akin to being a sex worker. Given Watts' self-proclaimed role as Ellen's moral champion, the model of the camellia as a redeemed figure seems a fitting metaphor for Ellen's salvation from the stage. Watts presents her as a camellia, capable of faithfulness and of great devotion, her pearls evoking her heart's purity. Yet, if the painting marks his joy that she has chosen to conform to societal expectations, her lusty absorption in the camellias invokes a woman inclined to the irrational consumption of sensory pleasures. Indeed, by presenting Ellen as smelling the scentless camellia in vain, her ruby lips pressed against red flowers, her husband portrays a naive and somewhat superficial girl in urgent need of moral guidance and purpose. And I do think that's how kind of Watts saw her, as quite sort of childish and highly spirited, sort of wanting to kind of laugh and run around and dance, but not being sort of sufficiently well-mannered and reserved in company. While Ellen had opted to marry Watts, in the painting, the figure's decision between the two flowers is uncertain, and the ambiguity of the camellia representing both loving and unpretending qualities and superficiality and pretentiousness suggests this unresolved dilemma. Despite the loftier connotations of smell in this painting, the pretense of the model's pose is as if lost in scent-inspired reverie over an unscented flower, might also point to an association between the olfactory and female mental illness. The second half of the 19th century saw a growing clinical concern about the degenerative state of the olfactory lobe, the part of the brain that deals with smell, in civilized man, and its relation to hysteria. In an article on olfactory pathology in the Lancet from 1881, a German-English physician, Julius Alphus, specializing in nervous disorders, gave an account of a woman who was often seen smelling flowers, but who possessed no olfactory nerves at all. Her habit of putting flowers to the nose was merely a pantomime, devoid of special meaning. Indeed, one often notices women, especially those of a lively temperament, carrying flowers to the nose, which are devoid of smell. Since Watts is known to have held strong views about the insincerity of acting as a career, and even its moral impact upon the female temperament, the charade of voracious scent inhalation presented in choosing might be read as indicative of his moral standpoint. Ellen was known for her youthful exuberation, and it seems that Watts interpreted this as mental instability. He wrote, for example, in a letter to a friend, "No excitement of any kind must be allowed when there is a common habit of hysteria and a pulse of 108. Moreover, by juxtaposing the cultivated camellia with a lively tempered female, Watts drew upon a Victorian iconography in which women of unstable temperament were compared to beautiful but fragile hothouse flowers, and the motif of smelling flowers reinforced stereotypes of women as leisured, emotional, and irrational. Ellen soon realized she'd made the wrong choice, later describing herself as having felt shrinking and timid, the girl wife of a famous painter among Watts's illustrious friends. Famously, of course, it was to prove unendurable for Ellen to blossom in obscurity. Their union lasted 10 months, after which she resumed her theatrical career. So just to conclude, the painting alludes to Watts's feelings about the process so recently undertaken by Terry of choosing between a flamboyant life on the stage and a comparatively sheltered life as his wife and muse. By framing the girl's moral conundrum in terms of a choice between humble scented violets and unscented yet glossy camellias, a floral iconography laden with moral symbolism, an understanding of the painting hinges upon Victorian ideas about the respective merits and pitfalls of the visual and the olfactory, the scented and the unscented, and the relative value systems embedded within the hierarchy of the senses. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. And Charlie, have we had questions?
Thank you so much, Christina. That was a wonderful talk and absolutely fascinating to explore this painting in so much detail. So we've got just got a couple of things in the questions area. If anybody wants to add any more, please do so, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So here we've got, someone has said, doesn't your vanity versus soulfulness interpretation include a moral or lesson that you said the pre-Raphaelites disdained or veered away from in contrast to their realist predecessors?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good point, actually. Yes, I suppose it does. Yes, it does have this kind of as I've explored this whole kind of moral process of choosing between the flowers and their meanings. But visually, they're very, very different kinds of paintings. You can just kind of look at this painting as being an exquisite painting that doesn't really have a story of just a woman smelling a flower. You don't have to kind of go into it sort of much deeper than that. It's not got the kind of really obvious moral narrative that the Stanhope has. So I think stylistically they're very different as well. It's not that kind of painstaking attention to detail of the kind of grueling reality of poverty and of Victorian life. It's something much more kind of pleasurable, a beautiful painting to have on the wall. But yes, as you say, it does have this kind of moral lesson still when you go in deeper.
Wonderful, thank you. Here we've got one. The Watts painting also can be interpreted by the position of hands, the violets near the heart.
Yeah, I think that's really relevant, that the violets are being held up near the heart. So the suggestion of the violets as being with its scent as kind of symbolic of love and the spirit, the soul.
I think there's one that's more of a comment here, really.
Whereas the camellias are up by the eyes, aren't they? So the visual, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that just one of the paintings, someone has put a comment that On the Brink, I think, is actually held at the Fitzwilliam.
I'm sure you're right. I was preparing in a hurry last night. I'm sure you're right. I always get these two muddled up.
Okay, we've got another one coming in here. I can't fully read that one. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about
the duh. No, I don't know what the duh is.
About the dress that she was wearing. Yeah.
Oh, the dress. Not really. I mean, it's a it always looks green to me, but it's a brown silk dress that she wore for her wedding day, designed by William Holman Hunt in the sexist style. So it's not the tight corseted style that women would have worn previously. It's a much kind of looser fit that's actually associated with a growing independence of women, because they're not so kind of tightly bound and they're more able to kind of move more freely.
Thank you.
I don't know where that dress is now. I don't think it still exists.
Any more questions from our audience? Oh yeah, here we are, there's one more. During this period, poetry, including references to flowers, may have influenced paintings, such as I'm not sure how you say that, Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, Orientalism, with roses symbolizing life and death.
Yeah, that's something I've never really got into. I don't know very much about that, but I do think those kind of Oriental, or those sort of Eastern images of Oriental kind of figures holding men holding flowers are interesting, because in Western culture, it's very, very rare to find images of men smelling. I showed you the Fred Hollanday Hypnos photograph from the 1890s. That painting is kind of controversial deliberately kind of controversial and provocative because it's so kind of sensual, showing a man smelling a flower. So it's kind of immediately obvious that it's a homoerotic image. But in general, images of people smelling or images of anyone kind of smelling, it's limited to women, children, a small amount of sort of Victorian gay men, non-white people. So basically, it's everyone who isn't the white Western male heterosexual man. It's the other. Whereas that's clearly not the case in some Eastern cultures. But that's not something I really know much about. I think it would be a really interesting kind of counterpart to my work.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think that's almost taken us to the end of our session this morning. Thank you again. It's been so interesting to hear you speak about the painting in so much depth. Our Art and Scent talks will continue on next week, and more information can be found on the Watts Gallery website. And Christina is due to speak with us again on the 29th of September. So thank you so much, and we hope to welcome everyone back again to another talk with us soon.
Thank you. Yeah, and do check out the Art History Festival programme and see what else is going on. Hope you can come to some more art history events this week.
Yes, it looks amazing. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Part of it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.